Now we've covered how earthquakes happen, where they can happen, and how to measure them. Now we have to look at what happens after an earthquake. What kind of destruction does that earthquake cause? And we're going to see that there are a lot of different factors that determine whether an area is destroyed or not. The most obvious of these is just the magnitude. The higher magnitude means that there's more energy released, so therefore higher magnitudes should see more destruction. When we're looking at our earthquake, the epicenter, the area on the surface that experiences the greatest amount of shaking, we're going to see that for around 50 kilometers, or about 30 miles surrounding that epicenter, all of that area is going to experience an equal amount of shaking. So it doesn't matter if the earthquake happened right underneath Orlando or if it happened 20 miles away. The entire area is going to shake the same amount. But once we get more than 50 kilometers, or about 30 miles away from the epicenter, that ground shaking is going to diminish really, really quickly. We're not going to feel it very long or very much outside of that 30 miles. But the exception is when we have an intraplate earthquake. When we have an earthquake happening in a place with really old, cold, and rigid rocks, it's going to allow that energy to move a greater distance, and you'll be able to feel the earthquake over a larger area of the surface. So, in addition to just the magnitude or the intensity of our earthquake, there are other factors that are going to determine how much damage this earthquake causes. The second major factor is just the duration. We're going to see that earthquakes that are lasting 3 minutes will do a lot more damage than an earthquake that only lasts for 30 seconds. But we also want to look at the nature of the surface and the building materials that are used. Different materials can either shake or break. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but if we live in an area with a lot of earthquakes, we want to build so that our buildings and our surfaces shake with the earthquake. If they try to resist the shaking, they're going to break. So if we can build our houses and our bridges and our roads so that they shake, there's going to be less damage than if they're really rigid material that will break and cause destruction. And our construction practices are important as well. We know how to join together the walls so that it shakes better than just building concrete walls. So different materials and different construction practices also have a big influence in different areas getting different amounts of destruction. We see that those materials that can shake and vibrate, like flexible wood and steel, they're going to do less damage or have less damage after an earthquake than things that are made out of blocks and bricks. Those do not shake, they're rigid, and instead they're simply going to collapse and cause more damage. What lies underneath the surface is also going to be important as well. We've talked a little bit about differences in rock, how with solid, cold rock, those seismic waves are going to travel a greater distance. But we have some major issues if we have soft sediment. So instead of having solid rock, if we have a loose sediment, when that sediment starts shaking, it causes the sediment around it to shake. So it's actually going to amplify the shaking or vibration within the ground. And it causes massive destruction. So in the image on the left, we can see some apartment buildings in Japan after an earthquake. These apartments were built on top of soft sediment. So when the earth started shaking, the sediment shook so much that the building simply toppled over like dominoes. But we can see that if we have an earthquake in an area with loose sediment, it can also cause something that's called liquefaction. And this happens when we are looking at an area where the ground is already saturated. It's full of water. And the energy waves, the seismic waves, can cause the water inside of that soil to make the soil behave like a fluid. This doesn't sound like a lot, but think about quicksand. Quicksand is a perfect type of liquefaction. It is a surface that behaves like a soil. If you stand on quicksand, even though it's solid ground, you're slowly going to sink into the surface. And this is what liquefaction is. It's very common after earthquakes in areas with loose sediment. But when we have this loose sediment, it's also going to cause lots of landslides. That sediment's simply going to slide downhill. It can also start settling downwards, causing land subsidence, where it looks like the surface is sinking down. And it can also cause massive fires. We see that most of our damage, or at least most destructive damage related to our earthquakes, is actually caused by our landslides. Once we have this land that is breaking down and sliding downhill due to gravity, it's going to very quickly cover anything in its path. It can cover not only your house, but an entire city within seconds. If our earthquake triggers a tsunami, we're in a whole nother ballgame. So our tsunamis happen on those megathrust faults, those convergent plate boundaries where we have subduction from an oceanic plate subducting underneath another plate. But when this happens, when we have movement along that megathrust, it's going to displace water. It's going to cause water really deep in our oceans to suddenly move. This is going to create ocean waves when in the middle of our ocean are going to travel at a really high speed, but they're going to be low amplitude. They're not going to be massive waves when they're in the middle of the ocean, where the earthquake actually happened. But as those ocean waves move from our open ocean closer to the shore, we're going to see that the coastal waters are going to get shallower and shallower as it gets closer to the beach. But as the water's getting shallower closer to the beach, those waves that are getting close are going to grow taller in height until eventually they can be hundreds of foot tall waves of ocean water that are crashing against our coast. These are incredibly destructive. We can get outside in an earthquake. We can try to find a safe place for a volcanic eruption. But with tsunamis, we have very little warning. And there's very little things that can protect us from a tsunami because, again, we could be talking about a 100-foot wave of water. It's so heavy and so powerful, it's going to move anything in its path. So one of the things to look out for to help predict a tsunami is if you're ever at the beach and it looks like the water is very, very quickly moving farther out to the sea. Like the beach is growing in size and the water's moving back out to the ocean. This is telling us that that water is being moved somewhere else. It's being moved farther back to help those waves grow up in height. So if you're ever at the beach and it looks like the water just suddenly retreats like a block or two, run the other direction. It is very likely that a tsunami is about to hit within maybe a few seconds or a couple of minutes. And this diagram is going to help explain how those tsunamis form just a little bit better. So looking up here at part A, this is before the earthquake. Here we have that oceanic plate subducting underneath an overriding plate, creating a megathrust fault. But when there's a lot of pressure here, the trench is going to be really deep, meaning that we're going to have a lot of water stored deep in our oceans. But when the earthquake happens, this subducted plate is going to suddenly lurch forward. It's going to release all of the built-up pressure right here. It's going to cause the overriding plate to uplift or bounce up after all of that pressure has released. But the issue is that all of this deep water that was in the trench before is now being pushed upwards because the land is going through elastic rebound and moving back to its position before it was under pressure. So it's going to force all of this water to move upwards, creating ocean waves. When we're really in deep ocean waters, in the middle of our oceans, the ocean water can be miles deep. So here, this huge mass of water being forced upwards isn't very consequential. But as the ocean wave starts moving towards our coastal areas, the depth of the sea starts getting shallower and shallower. So to combat this, the ocean waves start getting taller and taller until by the time they make their way to the coast, these tsunami waves can be 100 feet tall. For a really long time, we didn't have any tsunami warning system other than standing at the beach and saying, oh, look, the water's moving back, there might be a tsunami. But in the 1940s, most of the major countries around the Pacific Ocean, after discovering some of our plate tectonics that were going on, developed a tsunami warning system in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So here we put really large buoys, these floating devices in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they have these little tiny tidal gauges on them that can measure how high they're moving up and down in the water. Usually in the middle of our oceans, because they're so deep, the water at the surface doesn't move up and down very much. But if we have a mega thrust fault move and release in earthquakes, these deep sea buoys can start detecting the energy by just the changing height of the tidal gauges. It can give us up to a few hours notice that a tsunami could potentially hit somewhere around the Pacific Ocean. It's not great at telling us this could hit Alaska or this could hit Australia, but it is a step forward saying within the next few hours, it's likely that somewhere around the Pacific Ocean can have a tsunami so that people can get away from the coast and stay safe.